Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Into Their Minds Science Communicators Edition. In this series, we are taking a look at people who have established themselves in this field and also getting to know a bit about their journeys. Today we have a special in-person interview with Dr. Sandhya Shekhar. She is currently a program manager at Mongabay, India. Her articles can be found in a variety of publications including New Scientist, National Geographic, The Wire, the BBC and many more. Dr. Sandhya, thank you so much for joining us for this today.
It's a pleasure.
First off, could you tell us a bit about your journey from doing a PhD at IISc to freelance work to your current role at Mongabay, India? What was your motivation to take that leap from a well-trodden path in academia to a more offbeat career choice in science communication?
Yeah. I did my PhD from the Center for Ecological Sciences in the Indian Institute of Science, which is in Bangalore. And when I joined my PhD, I was interested in research, but I really wasn't sure what I'll do next. Then during the course of my PhD, I realized that I really don't see myself heading a lab or doing multiple projects, for the rest of your life. So that's a big thing to say. So I realized that I'm not really ready for that. And then I started exploring alternative career options. And it was at a conference that somebody was talking about this interface between academia and the rest of the world in general. And they said that while science journalism and science communication is an established field in other countries, it's yet nascent in India. I'm talking of 2010, 2011. So this field was not as popular as it has become now. After the conference, I started exploring options in this field, and coincidentally at the same time, the National Center for Biological Sciences was launching its science journalism workshop series. I was part of the very first batch from that NCBS science journalism workshop series. It was a 10-day immersive workshop, and I'm always grateful to my PhD advisor, Dr. Praveen Karan, who encouraged me and said, doesn't matter, take off your 2 weeks from PhD and do, if you're really interested, go for it. So I did the 10-day intensive workshop, and the advantage of such a workshop is it really lets you get your feet dirty. It's more hands-on, it doesn't give you a theoretical overview. So after the workshop was when I decided I'll shift tracks, and it was an unusual thing at the time because it was not like I hadn't published enough for my PhD. I did have a good publication record and I could have gone on to a postdoctoral fellowship, but I decided that if I want to shift, it's better I shift earlier than I wait and shift later. So after which I did a MA. After my MA, I was generally adrift for a while, so I freelanced a lot. And I must say at this stage that I was lucky in that I was the first wave of science communicators from India, so I was able to get my bylines into some of the leading science communication platforms across internationally. And that really gave me a good experience in the art of science journalism. So you learn a lot on the job. And it was around the same time that, I don't know how many of you have visited IISc, but there's this very famous coffee place in IISc, which is supposed to be the place of genesis of many ideas. So I ran into two friends in that coffee house. We came up with the concept of the Science Media Center at IISc. That organization sort of morphed into what is now known as Research Matters. And after Research Matters was established and all systems were in place and so on, I took a break, a maternity break. I had my daughter, and at the same time when I was getting back to work was when the advertisement for Mongabay came. And during my masters in the UK, I was an intern at Mongabay. So I had already worked with the main people at Mongabay, and I knew that it was a great team. And I was extremely happy that Mongabay was launching in India. and I wanted to be involved like from the very first. So because I knew that Research Matters was on its way and it will go the next stage, whatever, whether I'm there or not. So I realized that it's a good time to explore whether I'm a good fit for the program manager role at MongoDB India, and I got the job, and that's where I am now.
So could you tell us a bit more about MongoDB India? What does your role as program manager actually entail?
Okay, so when MongoDB launched in India, they hired myself and my colleague managing editor Gopi Krishna Warrior at the same time. India was always a geography where MongoDB wanted to expand because of the large audience base. Just because of our population and the English-speaking population we have in India, you'll just get millions of page views with much less effort than you would put into another country, for example. So when I joined MongoDB India, as I said, along with another colleague, we sort of made a division of labor between ourselves. So as a program manager, I have this end-to-end overview of all operations at MongoDB India. So starting with getting funds for the organization until the output and post-output analysis stage, I have this end-to-end overview. And I'm also in charge of admin and overall processes. I also give inputs into science-based articles that come out in MongoDB India. So the kind of work I do, you would not see Sandhya Shekhar byline anywhere, but then anything that comes out will have me somewhere in the workflow. So that's how, that's what the program manager does. I also take care of publication schedules with another colleague's help. I ensure that freelancers writing for MongoDB India get paid with the help of our accounting department. So we are all involved in ideation and innovative storytelling and so on. So it's a group exercise, and I'm sort of overall in charge of some part of the activity. Yeah.
So you've taken a more of a behind-the-scenes role.
Behind the scenes, yeah.
So I wanted to ask, how has the pandemic impacted your work? Has it reduced, or do you see a heightened demand for accurate and accessible scientific communication?
There's definitely there was a spike in demand as soon as the first lockdown came in 2020. You could actually see the numbers go up on the MongoDB India site around that time, because people were suddenly at home and they didn't have anything to do, so they were spending that much more time on social media and on web-based information sources. But now I feel there is a fatigue of pandemic-related news. I mean, beyond the point, people want to move on. They want to read about your 2020 cricket and whatever. So there is that. But coming to work matters, since we are a work from home organization, and even as a freelancer, it's not like I went to an office and worked or whatever. So for all work, many organizations have shifted to the model that MongoDB has always had, which is a work from home model with all meetings happening online and everything happening online. So I feel this is the future, or even a hybrid work model where some days you go to office and most days you sit at home.
So the pandemic has impacted in many ways, not just the workflow.
Overall, I think we chugged along pretty much as it was business as usual for us, rather than new normal or anything.
Definitely. So we mentioned a bit about storytelling in your articles early on. That's something I've found in a lot of pop science articles I've come across, where there's a lot of attention given to the storytelling aspect of science, much more than you would find in research publications. So how important do you consider the storytelling aspect in effective science communication?
I think, if you look at the audience of who reads popular science articles, there'll be two categories. One are those who are already invested in the topic. They've been following the topic for many, many years, and they will continue to follow that topic because that's what they're working on, that's what they're interested in. For them, this human angle of science, it's okay. I mean, it's part of the story, but it's not the story. But say you want to induct a new audience into your topic of interest. You want a new person who's not interested in evolution to pick up a paper on evolution, how do you get them interested? Is it possible that they'll be so interested in Darwin and Wallace, or will they be more interested in saying somebody was walking along the Western Ghats and they saw some lizard which they saw earlier in Arunachal Pradesh, and they realized that they look similar but they're genetically different. So this sort of a storytelling method draws in new audiences, which is also one of the motivations for communicating science. You're not just preaching to the choir, you want to extend your audience to multiple other people. So the human angle of science is what brings these new audiences in. So that is one integral part of science communication.
We relate better to the stories if we don't, even if we don't relate to the science.
Yeah. And you may have seen coverage about the Higgs boson, which went haywire in India because they called it the God particle and all. But I'm not saying go into sensationalist science, but there is definitely a human interest too. So it's both equally important. For the maximum public is not scientists or interested in science. So let's just assume that nobody is interested and start from there.
Yes.
It's a fair place to start.
Definitely. What do you think is keeping scientists from effectively communicating with the public? Do you think having a PhD kind of helps you to understand their language, helps you in your work?
So I'll answer the first part of the question first. So I don't know if you guys are aware, but in the early part of the 20th century, academic literature and popular science literature were really not so distinct from each other. So in places like Royal Society in London, instead of traditionally how right now you publish papers in this particular format and so on, people used to actually read out their paper. That's why it was called proceedings, because you'd have read it out somewhere, and it's recorded as proceedings and it's put in a journal. If you see the first, I don't know how many of you have seen Watson and Crick's first double helix paper. It's just a very short communication. And even if somebody who's not trained in biology were able to pick it up and read it, they won't have any trouble understanding what Watson and Crick have written. The English is that time's English, but apart from that, it's not like it's filled with jargon. So then what happened was academic publishing fields got more and more specialized. So for people within a field to communicate with each other, it became easier to use jargon. So, and the jargon also kept developing over time, right? So scientists had to think of everything in particular frameworks, which is not so evident to the outside public. So when you're thinking in that manner, coming out of it and talking to your grandmother or your uncle or aunt who's not in the science domain requires a shift in perspective, a shift in the way you talk, because it's very easy to just say, I don't know, some technical word and then expect everyone to understand. So, or think they understand, which is even more dangerous than not understanding, you know. So when science started evolving that way, then came the field of science communication, which was needed to sort of unpack complex academic concepts into a language that everyone can understand. Okay, that was one angle. Then when does it become journalism? It becomes journalism where people go a step further and figure out whether the paper is actually what it is promised, right? I mean, the paper says ABC, then the science communication press release will say ABC and then say it may have implications for blah, blah, blah. Then if a newspaper were to pick it up, they'll start with it may have implications first, and then the actual science would come lower down because they're looking for the newsiness of making it a little more interesting. Some newspapers want to make it more sensational, so they'll make spurious implications. I mean, they'll make it much more important than it actually is. So then you need journalism to balance it out, sort of add a criticism. I'm not saying every journalist has to be studying science so much that they'll be able to criticize scientific papers, but you always have other experts in the field who can give you criticism or ways of improvement. So a journalistic piece will have, okay, what's the study? This is what the authors say. And this external expert who was not involved in the study says that it's a great study or that it could have been done better in ABC way. So a journalist balances out those opinions. So that's how the field came about, and how a scientific training helps is that it helps you ask the right questions. So a paper is just focusing on the scientific development. A science communication, a press release about the paper will answer the 5 basic questions of journalism, which is the 5 W's and the H, right? How, what, where, why, who. So those questions will be answered in a science communication release. But what more? What are the additional layers there? What are the policy implications, if any? What are the larger linkages between what is found in one country versus what is prevalent in another country? So all those angles come in with journalism. And if you have a scientific training, firstly, it gives you the ability to reason out and look at the multiple angles. So you can identify the appropriate experts to ask these questions. And it gives you the confidence to approach scientists. Because a typical newspaper reporter in any of the Indian newspapers would have finished an undergraduate course in arts, say English or history, or even a BSc in biology, and then they'd have done a maybe master's in journalism, but maximum that's it. You tell them, you go talk to the scientist in IISc, how will the poor thing feel? And then, but if you are trained in science and you are confident that you can firstly read an academic paper, secondly, you're asking the right questions, and it gives you the confidence to go and approach scientists for their opinion. So I think I answered both parts of the question. Yeah.
So you talked a bit about how the normal qualifications are to the people asking these questions. So even though science communication is a bit of a nascent field in India, there are institutions that offer some kind of formal training or degrees in science communication. So I was wondering, what do you think the effectiveness of those courses are?
So if you have come from a BA or an arts background and you come into journalism, you learn the art of asking questions and asking questions openly. I mean, many journalists will ask questions which seem dumb, in quotes, but when you ask such questions, it brings out the best answers. So if you really pretend like I don't understand what you're talking about, that's when the person will give you the best, most eloquent answer, because they're like, oh my God, I have to make this person understand. So that is a capacity that a journalist training can bring in, apart from tool use, right? Like right now, mobile journalism, Mojo, is something that's very popular. So how do you, I know a lot of journalists who just work from their smartphone. So they're on Spot or whatever, and they're like taking interviews and bites, and they quickly do an edit and they send it off to the editor, just no computer, just on the smartphone. So tools like that. How do you use a video camera? How do you make that final cut? So you can learn all of it online with multiple in online courses. But then when you're doing a formalized course, it does give you additional insights. You learn from your peers as much as from your instructors. Gives you the practical field experience that otherwise is not available. If you're transitioning from a science background to a journalism background, as I was saying earlier, that frames under which you operate itself is different when you're within academia and you come outside academia. The way you write is different. So you have to unlearn what you've learned within academia, and then you have to implement an entirely new set of skills for which a course really helps. So it doesn't have to be a science journalism course. It can just be a journalism course. But it helps you because you realize how dense academic writing really is, and we are all trained for that. Well, I used to be trained for that. And then once you break out of it, getting back there is equally difficult. So it's not like I'm a scientist by day and I moonlight as a popular science communicator at night. That's really difficult. And those who do it, I don't know how they manage it, because it's completely different ways of communication altogether.
So I was also hoping to know, how do you bridge that gap between scientists and the public a bit more effectively?
Well, there are multiple levels to this question. So firstly, the scientists who are doing the research must be motivated must really want to communicate to the public, but that sort of innate I want to tell the public about what I'm doing is not really common. So I would say that there has to be a policy intervention here. All funding agencies say that this much of your money has to be allocated to popular science communication. That's the only way to get everybody to be interested in popular science communication, and for the institutions to come in and say that we need to have a press office because all these grants that these faculty members have this as a mandatory thing. So it's like having a women's reservation bill or something. It's a policy intervention that can have a series of effects of all job creation and larger availability of popular science content. So that is the policy angle that I think is important. So once scientists are motivated enough and they say, okay, now we have to do it, then there needs to be a machinery in place to ensure that good quality popular science communication can happen. And that is very possible in large multi-speciality institutes where you can have people interested in communication, students who can handle the popular science communication. And lastly, while all this is good, we're still talking about the English language mainly. And I think adding local language as an additional layer to science communication is extremely important. Recently at Mongabay, we launched Mongabay Hindi, recently meaning a year ago. But the English Bureau has been around for 3.5 years now. So, but the kind of impact that the Hindi Bureau has had is very different from it reaches an entirely different demographic. And recently our thrust has been on indigenous communities and mining and India's energy transition policies and so on. And those are highly esoteric topics that can easily get lost in silos in NGOs and think tanks and government agencies. But linking it to on-ground reality is something that is essential for, I'm not saying that you link quantum physics to ground reality. As I said, regional language communication becomes very important. But another gap that I find is that there's a lot of misinformation as of now in popular media. I'm sure all of us are part of WhatsApp groups where we see all kinds of ludicrous statements being made. But an important part of science communication is also making available accurate information to balance out prevalent misinformation, which came to light with the COVID-19 pandemic. So vaccine hesitancy, which was never a thing in India, but it has started, right? I mean, it did have an important role to play when the first round of vaccination was going on. All sorts of wrong correlations were prevalent. At that time, what is the role of a science communicator would be to debunk a lot of these myths with a series of very simple, I don't know, even a face-to-camera video saying, this is nonsense and whatever. So scientists can do that. Say that I'm standing here in, I don't know, ICMR and I've just come out of my lab and I'm telling you that that's fine, vaccines are safe. So scientists can take on because in Indian society, scientists are highly respected. Scientists and people doing science can take on the role of fighting misinformation. And across the world, there is a lot of conversation about misinformation, and one of the theories that they've come up with now is that you preempt possible misinformation. So we all know that there is going to be a conference of parties on climate change in Glasgow next week. And so that after this conference, India is going to say, we'll do this to fight climate change. And that after that, there is possibility that for different motivations, people put out videos saying that climate change is not real or whatever. It's very common in the US. They even go to the level of these deep fakes. I don't know if you guys have seen those really creepy videos of people being made to say other things. So it's gone to that level, the misinformation field. What can we do as responsible science students and scientists to fight this is to make accurate information available to the public in multiple languages. So I think that's an important gap.
So, ma'am, what advice do you have for hopeful science journalists? What are there some skills that you consider vital to the craft and something that people should focus on if they want to get into the field?
Yeah. So one thing that I've realized is that as part of our training that we get while doing research, we get a set of skills that can be adapted to many other careers. Many times we don't realize the kind of skills that we develop as part of a training for research that we can apply to others. So I think if you are interested in science communication, keeping that ability to ask questions alive is one of the most critical aspects. And other tools that you require can also always be picked up along the way. So you're interested in multimedia, you're interested in photography or videos or podcasts, everything can be picked up. But then the basic criteria for all this, the underlying skill is the ability to ask the right question so that your article comes alive for the reader. So that is one skill set. So there are a lot of online courses now for anything you want to learn. Most of them are free, so make use of that as resource when you this thing. But more importantly, figure out if this is actually what you want to do later. And one way of doing that is to be part of science communication endeavors within your within your institute where you are itself. So that you realize whether you try to figure out whether you want to continue in academia or you want to branch out into communication, and if you do, whether you want to be press officer or you want to be a journalist or you want to be a freelancer who does a bit of both, or whether you want to write or you want to illustrate or whether you want to make video. It's good to get your feet wet before you make the actual decision. And also think of throw back to the personality thing I was talking about earlier. What do you think will suit you as a person better? Are you the kind who's happy, who has enough self-motivation to do your proceed as a freelancer? Or do you want that overall structure of being part of a larger team to keep you at your best? So these are all some factors that you can think of. Yeah.
Definitely, thank you. So, what are the roadblocks that you encountered on your journey? Looking back, is there something that you wish you'd done differently?
When I started off, there were not many other, very few other science journalists and science communicators in the country that I could write to and get tips from. That was definitely a resource crunch, but that threw me in the deep end without anybody to guide. But that also presents an immense learning opportunity. So it all depends on how you look at it. So I don't think I would have done anything differently, because I think each aspect of my previous my career trajectory has contributed in some way to where I am now. But this is definitely, there are also a lot of online resources now for somebody wanting to start off as a science communicator or a science journalist, but that wasn't there when I started off in 2010, 2011. So that's one lack of, how is the space, what is it going to be like? So I could have very easily started off and decided this is not for me and ditched the whole thing. But luckily that didn't happen and I enjoyed what I was going to do. But right now I think there's much more opportunity for people to test the waters before jumping in. So
it's definitely, the scene has improved a bit.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. At least in English language.
Okay.
Not so much in regional languages yet. So if somebody is looking for branching out into science communication, I think regional language is the way to go.
Carving out your own niche, kind of. Yeah, makes sense. Last question. So, as you're working at an environment-based news portal at Mongo Bay, India, you kind of can be seen as an intermediary between scientists and the public. So do you see that science has become a bit more politicized over the years, particularly fields like ecology and climate change, or has it always been that case?
I think rather than talking about, we can't take politics out of environment and we can't take environment out of politics. But I think the fact that almost all political and socio-economic, political, all discourse has some linkage to the environment is something that is becoming more and more evident to us now, simply because that environment is the base of so many other things, and now that it's under threat in so many ways, that these linkages are becoming more apparent.
Okay.
So I think we've been working at Mongo Bay India on a series called Hewing the Regulatory Tree, where we look at our entire environment legislation framework as a large tree which has been systematically broken down, not just by one government but by multiple governments over time, to really have an impact on the legislative framework for India's framework for political, economic, whatever framework for India's environment. And these linkages are more apparent now because the environment is under threat. Like one of my colleagues says that every story is an environment story. So just because we are an environment publication, it doesn't mean that we are not going to write about some political development or whatever. So we in fact did an entire series on environment and elections where we looked at environmental issues and their relevance to the 2019 national elections. So yeah, I think that's a valid question, because I think ultimately, as my colleague says, every story is an environment story. Yeah.
Okay. Ma'am, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a delight talking to you,
It's been a
and I'm
pleasure,
sure our audience would have benefited greatly from hearing your views. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Yeah.